The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $60 on a Saturday morning in the second week of October, 1979. And the sound of that gavel was almost swallowed up by the laugh that rolled out of Delbert Hoyt's chest like a truck coming down a grade with no brake. It was a wet, showy laugh, the kind a man practices without knowing he's practicing it, and it carried across the gravel lot of the old Renner farm outside of Sabetha, Kansas, where the estate of Milo Renner was being sold off in pieces beneath a white tent. The item on the block was a soldered cash tin. That was what the auctioneer called it, and the description was generous. It looked like a bread box that had been left out in 3 winters and forgotten in a fourth. The metal was a dull pewter gray where it wasn't freckled with rust the color of old blood. Someone, a long time back, had run a bead of lead solder around the seam of the lid, sloppy in places and careful in others, so that the whole box was sealed shut like a tomb no larger than a Sunday hat. There was a keyhole on the front, but the key was gone, and even if a key had been offered, the solder would have made it useless. The corners were dented. One side wore a long scuff where something heavy had dragged across it. It weighed more than it looked like it ought to, and when the auctioneer had shaken it earlier, there was a soft, muffled shift inside, the sound of paper packed tight, and maybe something else underneath the paper that did not want to move. The woman who bought it was named Ada Winifred Cole. She was 68 years old that autumn, a widow going on 11 years, and she stood at the edge of the tent in a canvas barn coat the color of a field left fallow, her gray hair pinned up under a soft felt-work cap that had belonged to her husband before the cancer took him. Her face was long and deeply lined, weathered by wind more than by sun, and her eyes were the pale, steady blue of a whetstone left in rainwater. Her hands, when she raised the paper number to bid, were the first thing anyone with sense would have noticed about her. They were narrow and strong and marked all over with small white scars, the kind that come from decades of working with sharp, small things. 2 knuckles on her right hand were flattened where a hammer had missed once 40 years ago, and never quite forgot Ada Cole was a locksmith. She had learned the trade from her father, Elwood Cole, who had learned it from his uncle in St. Joseph, Missouri, back when a locksmith still made his own picks and cut keys by eye and file. She had inherited the little brick shop on Main Street with the bell above the door and the wooden bench worn smooth in 2 places from her father's elbows, and she had kept it open through her widowhood, through the arrival of the big hardware chain out on the highway, and through the slow disappearance of the sort of customer who understood that a lock was not a puzzle to be defeated but a mechanism to be respected. Delbert Hoyt was 49 that October. He ran a used car lot on the west side of town, a lot he had inherited from his father-in-law and then plastered with red and yellow pennants until it looked like a birthday party for a bank. He wore, that morning, a green and white checked sport coat over a canary yellow shirt, and a gold ring on his little finger that caught the pale autumn light every time he moved his hand. His car was parked at the front of the row, a late model Lincoln Continental washed that morning, and Ada Cole's truck was parked at the back of the row, a 1962 Chevrolet pickup the color of an old barn with a dent in the tailgate that had been there since before her husband died. Delbert Hoyt laughed the way he laughed, and then he leaned to the fellow beside him and said, "Loud enough to travel? Ada, honey, you just paid $60 for a lunch pail somebody drowned." A few men chuckled. One woman looked at her shoes. Delbert Hoyt was not done. "You gonna cut that thing open with them little bitty files of yours? Gonna take you a month of Sundays? What you reckon's in there, Ada? Milo's grocery lists? A dead mouse and a nickel, and he named it, right there under the tent. The way his kind always name things, the lead loaf, he called it. Ada Cole and her $60 lead loaf. She stepped up to the clerk's table and counted 3 20s out of a small leather wallet that had been her husband's, and she signed her name in the ledger in the neat, slanting hand her mother had taught her before the First World War. She took the receipt. She took the tin. She carried it herself, both hands under it, to the bed of the old Chevrolet, and she set it down on a folded wool blanket she had brought for that purpose, and she did not look at Delbert Hoyt once. And what the crowd did not know, and what Delbert Hoyt certainly did not know, was that when Ada Cole had stood over that tin 10 minutes earlier, before the bidding started, she had leaned down and set her scarred fingers lightly on the solder bead, and she had felt something that no one else in that tent had felt. The solder was not a repair. The solder was a signature. It had been laid down by a careful, patient hand that meant for the tin to be opened one day, but only by someone who understood what patient work looked like. There were 3 small stamped initials pressed into the lead near the hinge, so faint you would miss them if you did not know to look, and Ada Cole had known Milo Renner's initials since she was a girl. She had learned her trade at her father's bench in that same little brick shop, and her father had taught her one thing above all others. He had told her more than once, holding a half-cut key up between them in the yellow lamplight, that a lock was a promise a man made to himself about what mattered. A cheap lock meant a man was pretending. A good lock meant a man was serious, and a lock that had been sealed by hand, without a keyway anyone could use, meant that the man who made it was speaking to the future and hoping the future. That was the whole of her father's teaching, and Ada Cole had carried it in her hands for 52 years. She drove home slow along the county road, the tin riding on the wool blanket like a sleeping child, and the elms along the shoulder were already going the color of wheat tea. The town of Sabetha slid past her window in the way small towns do. When a person has lived in them long enough to stop seeing the buildings and start seeing the years attached to them. She passed the feed store where her husband had bought his last sack of oats. She passed the Methodist church where she had been married in 1934. She passed the diner where, by supper time, Delbert Hoyt's story about the lead loaf would already be halfway through its second telling. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't, and Ada Cole had lived inside that kind of patience for most of her adult life. She carried the tin into her shop by the back door and set it on the long oak workbench under the green-shaded lamp that had hung there since her father's time. She took off her coat. She hung her cap on the peg. She washed her hands at the deep porcelain sink, dried them on a linen towel, and stood a long moment looking down at the box. The shop was quiet, the way a good shop is quiet, which is to say it was full of small, orderly sounds, the tick of the wall clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the back, the faint creak of the building settling into the cool of evening. She turned the tin 1/4 turn and then another. She read it the way another woman might read a letter from a friend long absent. Milo Renner had been a bachelor farmer of the old kind, 79 years old when he died the previous spring of a stroke in his kitchen with a cup of coffee still warm on the table. He had farmed the same 160 acres north of Sabetha for 53 years, and before that He had been a boy who went off to France in 1917 and came home in 1919 with a limp and a silence that never quite lifted. He had never married. He had once been engaged to a girl named Cora Bledsoe from over near Seneca, and the engagement had ended in the summer of 1922 under circumstances that the town had chewed over for a decade and then folded up and put away because there was no one left willing to argue about it. Cora Bledsoe had gone east and married a man named Harlan Pruitt, and the story that had settled over the county like a light dust was that Milo Renner had cheated her father in a land deal, taken back the ring, and kept the money. It was not a loud story. It was the kind of story a town tells quietly at kitchen tables when the person being spoken about has walked out of the room. Milo Renner had lived under that story for 57 years, and he had never once, so far as anyone knew, tried to correct it. Ada Cole had known Milo Renner all her life. He had brought her father a padlock to repair in 1931, and he had brought her a padlock to repair in 1968, and both times he had paid in cash and taken his hat off inside the shop. He had been, to her eye, a decent, quiet man, carrying a weight she did not understand. And now she stood at her bench on the 6th evening of October 1979 with that man's sealed tin under her lamp, and she understood that whatever the weight had been, he had put a piece of it inside this box and soldered it shut with his own hand. She began that night. She did not hurry. She took a soft brass brush from the drawer and cleaned the rust from the seam, a quarter-inch at a time. She wet a rag with kerosene and worked it into the pitting until the lead solder shone dull silver under the lamp. She set a small mirror at an angle and studied the way the bead had been laid, the little overlaps and pauses that told her where Milo Renner had steadied his hand and where he had rested and started again. She thought about him doing this work, an old soldier in a farmhouse kitchen, at his own table maybe, with a soldering iron heating on the wood stove, and no one to watch him and no one to tell. She did not cut it open the way Delbert Hoyt had said she would with little bitty files, though she had files enough on the wall behind her to have done it that way. She did not use a saw, because a saw would have thrown filings into whatever lay inside, and whatever lay inside deserved better. She used instead a small copper-tipped soldering iron of her own, an older tool than she was, and she went along the bead the same way Milo Renner had come along it 50-some years before, warming the lead a half-inch at a time and lifting it away with a scrap of wick, so that what came off her bench at the end of that first night was a thin, gray coil of solder in a china saucer, like a lock of hair saved from a christening. It took her 4 nights. She worked from supper time until the wall clock struck 11, and then she cleaned her tools and covered the tin with a square of muslin and went upstairs to bed. During the day she opened the shop as usual. She cut keys for the Henshaw boy who had locked himself out of his mother's Buick. She rekeyed the front door of the parsonage for the new minister. She listened, without appearing to listen, as Ollie Bergstrom came in on Tuesday for a new mailbox lock and stood at the counter a full 3 minutes, working himself up to say what he had come to say, which was, at last, "Ada folks are talking. Delbert's got the whole diner calling it the lead loaf. He says you'll never crack it, says you wasted $60 good. And Ada Cole, threading a blank onto the cutter, said only, "It'll open." Ollie Bergstrom waited for more, and when no more came, he paid for his lock and left, and the bell above the door rang the small, honest sound it had rung since 1911. On the 4th night, a Wednesday, the 10th of October, The last inch of solder came away under her iron, and the lid of the tin rose a quarter-inch of its own accord, released from its long holding, and there came from the seam a soft, dry sigh, a sound like a held breath finally letting go after a very long time. Ada Cole set down her iron. She wiped her hands on the linen towel. She sat on the tall stool at the bench, and she looked at the tin for a full minute without touching it, out of respect for the man who had sealed it, and for whatever it was he had trusted to the dark. Then she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had been folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth, there were 3 things. There was a leather billfold, cracked along its spine, and inside the billfold there were 42 $20 gold certificates from the series of 1922. Crisp and unfolded, laid flat between 2 pieces of stiff brown paper. There was, beneath the billfold, a document folded in thirds and tied with a piece of butcher's twine, and when she untied it and opened it under the lamp she saw that it was a bill of sale dated the 11th of August, 1922, signed by Josiah Bledsoe, transferring 80 acres of bottomland along Wolf Creek to Milo J. Renner for the sum of $1,400 paid in full, and marked at the bottom in Josiah Bledsoe's own hand with the words, "With my thanks and my blessing on the marriage." There was a receipt clipped to it from the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Seneca for the deposit of that sum on the same date. And under those 2 things there was a letter, written in a careful, slanting hand on 3 sheets of ledger paper, and Ada Cole read it slowly, once through, and then a second time with the lamp pulled closer. The letter was addressed to whoever should open the box. It said that Milo Renner had loved Cora Bledsoe, and Cora Bledsoe had loved him, and that in the summer of 1922 her father, Josiah, had sold him the 80 acres along Wolf Creek to give the young couple a start. It said that 4 days after the sale, Josiah Bledsoe had died on the road between his farm and town, when his wagon went into the ditch, and that the money paid for the land had been in a satchel under the seat of that wagon, and that the satchel had been taken by whoever came upon the wreck first and never seen again. It said that Cora's brother Franklin, being the eldest, had accused Milo Renner of taking the money back after the sale, of cheating a dead man, of driving his own father-in-law into the ditch. It said that Milo Renner had had no way to prove otherwise, because the receipt and the bill of sale had been left in Josiah's own strongbox at the farmhouse, and Franklin Bledsoe had produced no such papers when the estate was settled, and had sold the 80 acres a second time to a neighbor named Purdy, and had pocketed that money too, and had used the story of Milo Renner's supposed treachery to explain, ever after, why the family had lost so much so quickly. It said that Cora had believed her brother. That was the sentence Ada Cole read twice. It said that Cora had believed her brother, and had given back the ring, and had gone east, and had not written, and had married Harlan Pruitt in the spring of 1924, and had borne him 1 daughter, and had died of influenza in the winter of 1936 at the age of 37, and had never known the truth. It said that Milo Renner had carried the papers home the day of Josiah's funeral, and had kept them in the drawer of his kitchen table for 51 years, and that on the day he turned 75 he had taken them out and put them in this tin, along with the money he had saved back over the years for Cora's daughter. 42 $20 gold certificates, 1 for each year since Cora had left him, and he had sealed the tin with his own hand because he did not want it opened by anyone who would not understand what it was. He asked In the last paragraph, in words that were plain and did not tremble, that whoever opened the box find Cora Bledsoe Pruitt's daughter if she still lived, and give her the papers and the money and this letter, and tell her that her mother had been loved honestly, and that the story the family had believed was not the true story. He signed it, Milo J. Renner. On the 18th day of March, 1975, Ada Cole sat a long time at her bench. The lamp made a small yellow circle on the oak, and everything outside the circle was the dark of a shop at midnight. She thought, as any honest person will think in such a moment, about what she was holding. 42 gold certificates from 1922, uncirculated, were worth a good deal more than their face value even in 1979, and even the face value was more money than she had ever held at one time in her 68 years. She could have burned the letter in the stove and slid the certificates into the safe in the floor beneath her feet and told no one, and no one would ever have known. Milo Renner was dead. Franklin Bledsoe was 40 years in the ground. There was no one left to ask. She folded the letter along its creases and set it on the oilcloth beside the billfold and the bill of sale. She rose. He went upstairs and slept, and in the morning she made 2 telephone calls. The first was to the county clerk's office in Seneca, and by 10 o'clock that morning she had the name and the town of Cora Bledsoe Pruitt's daughter, a woman named Nell Pruitt Ashby, 61 years old, a widow herself, living in a small house in Hannibal, Missouri. The second call was to Nell Pruitt Ashby, and it was a short call, and Ada Cole said only that she had come into possession of some papers that had belonged to a man who had known Nell's mother, and that she would like to bring them by in person. Ada Cole drove to Hannibal on Saturday the 13th of October in the old Chevrolet with the tin on the seat beside her wrapped in the same wool blanket. She found the house without much trouble. Nell Pruitt Ashby was a tall, thin woman, with her mother's dark hair gone gray at the temples, and she stood in her front room in a gray cardigan and read the letter through twice, the way Ada had read it, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady, and she said, "Thank you for bringing this to me." Ada Cole set the billfold and the bill of sale on the small mahogany table by the window. She said, "Only, he wanted you to have it." She did not sit down. She did not stay for coffee. She was back in her truck within 20 minutes, and back in Sabetha by supper time, and she opened the shop on Monday morning as though nothing at all had happened. But things had happened. Nell Pruitt Ashby was a librarian, and she knew how to work a paper trail. Within 6 weeks, the bill of sale had been examined by a lawyer in St. Joseph and authenticated by a document man in Kansas City, and a small notice had appeared in the Sabetha Herald, and then a full column in the Kansas City Star under the headline, "57-Year-Old Injustice Corrected by Kansas Locksmith." The story ran with a photograph of the tin opened on Ada Cole's workbench and a photograph of Milo Renner in his uniform from 1918 and a photograph of Cora Bledsoe at 19 taken the summer before her father died. The story named Franklin Bledsoe, and it named the Purdy family, and it laid out the whole matter in the careful way such things are laid out when a lawyer has been over them first. He was seen that November, sitting at the counter reading the Star article, and he set the paper down and paid for his coffee and went out, and he said very little about Ada Cole after that, and he said nothing at all about lead loaves. His car lot lost the Ford franchise the following spring for reasons that had nothing to do with Ada Cole, and by 1982 he had sold what was left of it and moved with his wife to a suburb of Tulsa, and the pennants came down off the wires. The tin itself, after Nell Ashby was done with it, came back to Sebetha because she asked that it should. It was placed in the summer of 1980 in a small glass case in the front hall of the Nemaha County Historical Society, with the letter and the bill of sale on display beside it, and a small brass plaque that read, "Sealed by Milo J. Renner, 1975. Opened by Ada W. Cole, 1979. In memory of Cora Bledsoe Pruitt and Josiah Bledsoe, whose names are here restored." Ada Cole went to see it once, on an evening in September after the Historical Society was closed, when the light in the hall was low and the street outside was empty. She stood on the sidewalk and looked in through the window for perhaps 2 minutes, and then she got back in her truck and drove home, and did not speak of it to anyone. She kept the shop open 11 more years. She trained, in her last decade, a quiet young man named Wendell Six, whose grandfather had known her father, and she taught him to read a lock the way her father had taught her to read one. And she told him more than once that a lock was a promise a man made to himself about what mattered. She died in the spring of 1991, at the age of 79, of pneumonia in the small apartment above the shop, and Wendell Six kept the shop after her, and the bell above the door still rings. So I will leave it there with you, and I will ask you the question that Ada Cole never asked anyone. If you had been the one to lift that lid and see 42 gold certificates and a letter from a dead man that no living soul was waiting on, would you have driven to Hannibal on a Saturday morning to give it all away, or would you have closed the lid and turned off the lamp and gone quietly upstairs to bed?